Well, the leaders of Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa will virtually address the BRICS Forum shortly. The gathering of emerging world economies is being hosted this time by China. A major focus is Russia amid the Ukraine crisis. President Vladimir Putin says Russia's focus will shift from Europe and the West to Asia and Africa. This as Russia's oil exports to China and India increase.
It is important that, despite all the problems and difficulties, the BRICS business circles are consistently expanding mutually beneficial ties in trade, financial and investment areas. Thus, the trade turnover of the Russian Federation with the countries of the five in the first 3 months of this year increased by 38%, up to $45 billion. And, of course, we are actively engaged in rerouting our trade flows and foreign economic contacts towards reliable international partners, primarily the BRICS countries.
Meanwhile, Chinese President Xi Jinping warned against expanding military ties.
For some time, economic globalization has faced headwinds and countercurrents. Some countries attempt to decouple with others, sever supply chains, and build a small yard with high fences. There is widespread concern in the international community that, should such a tendency continue, the global economy will become compartmentalized and mutually exclusive. Economic globalization is a response to development of productivity and represents an unstoppable historical trend. Anyone who attempts to turn back the wheel of history and block others' way will only have his own path blocked.
Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi spoke of the importance of the BRICS nations in a post-COVID world. He says they can become the engines of growth.
ब्रिक्स की स्थापना इस विश्वास से हुई थी कि इमर्जिंग इकोनॉमीज का यह समूह वैश्विक ग्रोथ के इंजन के रूप में उभर सकता है। आज जब पूरा विश्व पोस्ट कोविड रिकवरी पर फोकस कर रहा है, तब ब्रिक्स देशों की भूमिका एक बार फिर बहुत महत्वपूर्ण रहेगी।
Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro acknowledged recent shocks in global supply chains and trade flows and said that he plans to keep Brazil open to trade with the rest of the world. For more, we're being joined now by our correspondent Siddhant Sibbal from New Delhi. Siddhant, to how big an extent is the Russia-Ukraine war dominating these proceedings?
Well, BRICS is a grouping which is dominated by China and Russia, so no open discussions when it comes to Russian invasion of Ukraine. But of course, it's fallout, the impact in terms of the price rise, commodity prices, the supply chain disruption is something that is expected to be discussed without, of course, the mention of Moscow's aggression. But we need to remember that this was primarily an economic grouping. It emerged after the financial crisis of 2008, and it has been taking political issues as well, but there are a lot of divergences within the grouping. India and China do not have a very good relationship. The Chinese aggressiveness at the border is still remembered here, and that has led to a downward trajectory in the relationship. So essentially, when it comes to this grouping, while a lot of progress has been made because of the differences between New Delhi and Beijing, question is how long this grouping can essentially have that glued together. But of course, India and Russia have good relationship. Yesterday, we saw the Russian President Vladimir Putin talking about Indian retail chains in Russia being talked about. So there are convergences as well. Today's meeting will be important in terms of the joint statement as to how the grouping essentially talks about areas of convergences. And this is the first summit-level meeting between the leaders, virtually, of course, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, you mentioned it being a virtual meeting, Siddhant. Of course, the BRICS nations are very much dealing with COVID-19 in a different way these days. That's another example of divergence.
Well, of course, when it comes to the COVID crisis, all the countries have different set of helping each other, helping the world, and of course helping themselves as well. One of the key issues has been the origin of the COVID crisis. This is something that has been discussed across the world, and the Western countries are keen when it comes to this issue. But when it comes to this grouping, they're obviously not going to discuss in terms of blaming China, primarily because China is a key member of this grouping.
What about trade supply chains, though? You mentioned by Jair Bolsonaro. We heard Narendra Modi talking about a post-COVID recovery. Well, China is very much still in a zero-COVID world. Is that likely to be a bone of contention between the BRICS nations?
Well, even if there are areas of divergences and contention, it's not going to be reflected in the joint statement, or at least in the opening statement, because the opening statement, of course, will be live. What will be talked about publicly or will be seen being talked about is the common camaraderie despite the divergences. And what Russia is going to do today will be interesting and important, because Russia will be keen to show that it has a set of partners across the world, and two important countries, China and India, together. And yesterday we saw that pretty important statement and interesting statement as well, because the Russian president at the BRICS Business Forum talked about essentially how India and China have emerged as important importers of Russian crude oil. We know that Russian energy is facing sanctions from the West, from US, and of course Europe also talking about this issue. So Russia will be keen that two big economies in Asia become essentially in terms of importer of Russian goods, and of course Russia becomes a big market for Indian and the Chinese goods. So Russia will be keen to use this BRICS format for, of course, talking to world leaders at a time when it has been facing growing isolation from Europe, from the West. So essentially the BRICS groupings meeting is important in that terms. But also, we need to understand that this meeting is coming just days before the G7 meeting. The G7 meets in Bavaria from Sunday. So that we will see a strong statement from the G7 group of countries when it comes to dealing with Russia and sending a strong message to Moscow.
Siddhant, thank you.